This is the third of our presentations on Jordan Peterson. The one I'll discuss today, I'm going to focus on, is Jordan Peterson and the Bible, mythical and mystical exegesis. Jordan Peterson is, I mentioned in an earlier email, very Renaissance, and in one sense, people will focus on different aspects of his life, his talks, his writings. In that sense, he's a bit like a mountain. I live in British Columbia near the Cascade Mountains, and depending on what part of a mountain you go up, you're going to see different things. And the higher up you get, you'll see certain things in the lower levels. If you go up another side of the mountain, you're going to see different things on the mountain, and you'll see different things in the lower landscape. Well, in that sense, Jordan Peterson is a bit like a mountain, and depending what side you go up, there's different things going to be seen about him. Some people tend to focus on the Bill C-16, the Cathy Newman interview, neo-feminism, cultural Marxism, social justice warriors, many other aspects of him, and that's part of going up the mountain of Jordan Peterson and trying to understand who he is and his appeal and his varied responses to a variety of issues and questions. What I want to touch on today is Peterson and the Bible. Obviously, there are going to be certain people are very drawn to that element of Peterson's work for the simple reason that they come from some sort of a religious background, or some with no religious background, and they want to just see the Bible as a text that leads to oppression and war and many other things. And so Peterson, in the work on his work on the Bible, has drawn hundreds and hundreds in Toronto to his lectures, and as a result of that, people are responding to Peterson's view of the Bible. And I might just say a few things before I touch on Peterson, his particular approach to interpreting the Bible, a more mythical approach, or one would call a psychological approach, and the valuable and important way of approaching the text in that way. But first things first, one of the dilemmas we face today is a high level of cultural illiteracy. If we were to ask many people in our sort of post-Christendom, multicultural society, how well they know the Bible or do they know anything about it, you'll find that the level of sheer illiteracy in terms of the myths, the themes, the stories of the Bible, it doesn't exist at all. So here's the text, which has been foundational not only for Western civilization, but it's probably one of the most translated books in all the world. Most people today really have little or no understanding of what it's about. It's various genres, and there are multiple genres in the Bible. And so that's, first of all, a dilemma. When a culture loses any sort of foundation, or even its historic texts are not known anymore, it's quite understandable why people flounder. When the markings are gone, when the cairns disappear, how does one hike both individually and then culturally? Because memory, these texts are really memory, and they guide people in terms of grappling with the very layered issues of life. The other issue with the Bible, of course, of which Jordan Peterson will come as a critic of, is some grow up within a religious setting, various forms of, it could be Judaism. Obviously, most of the Bible is the Hebrew canon, or what Christians call the Old Testament. There's the Apocrypha, and then the New Testament would be about 10% of the Bible. But you'll get many people that'll start when young, if they grow up in a religious family. They're introduced to the Bible, but their understanding of the Bible is really not much more than a Sunday school level. And so if they leave behind their religious upbringing and they go on to mature as people, usually in some sophisticated, mature technical skill, they could be dentists, doctors, a variety of issues, they never continue to grow at the same level in terms of their understanding of a text and how you interpret as they would with their particular skill, which they'll go on and get a BA, MA, or whatever in their life. So you've got many people today are fairly immature when it comes to how you read a classical text like the Bible, the same with Plato or Aristotle or any of these things. And on the other hand, they can be very, very mature. So these are two levels. We have a very crude illiteracy in our culture at the present time, in which there's no no memory of these texts and what they mean and what they stand for. And Jordan Peterson is obviously appealing to that. And then you have a slightly subtler understanding that people have read it, but in terms of interpreting it, it's very simplistic and, as I mentioned, fairly Sunday schoolish in its approach. And Jordan Peterson is obviously calling people back to this great text of Western civilization, and it doesn't mean he's doing it to the exclusion of other important texts, whether it's the Tao Te Ching or various Indian texts, the Vedas, Bhagavad Gita. I might also add that he also turns to very important, as I'll touch on a little later, the important role of fairy tales as well. And there's a close connection between fairy tales and myth, which I'll allude to as I move along. One of the other areas when it comes to the Bible then is, and this is again where Peterson would say, yes, there's a significant element to the Bible, but how do we read the text? Okay, so let's not slip into simple literalism. So for example, the book of Genesis, he did a lot of work in Genesis. Now there's a tendency for them who are biblicists in that sense, or literalists, say the early chapters in Genesis, you have the 6 days of creation, the seventh day of rest, and then people who are like that then do sort of a timeline, and you have a young earth notion, okay? And so then you get into the whole evolution creation debate in terms, and so the Bible is used to justify a dualism between science and evolution and creation, a young earth view of creation. That doesn't interest Peterson whatsoever. In terms of trying to give somewhat, people would see some objective understanding, which the Bible and history and archaeology and dating things come together. This is not something that holds his attention in any serious or significant way. And so people who come from that more literalist, or what we would call fundamentalist background, they would have obviously problems with Jordan Peterson. So it's one thing to say, let's get back to the Bible and the significance of the Bible. It's another thing to say, how do we interpret that text and how do we make sense of it in a thoughtful, layered way? There's others who will they tend to see the Bible as you mine it for certain confessions or certain creeds, and so you'll get, say, the neo-Calvinists in a group like that, is they'll try and in terms of how they're approaching the text, they want to know by looking at Ephesians and Romans and Galatians and books like this. What does this say about a penal theory, the atonement and justification? Well, those sort of theological themes again are not something that primarily interest Jordan Peterson in his journey. Again, what you're dealing there, just as in the literalists, so in elements of the neo-Calvinists, they're looking at what you see some sort of objective attempt in the Bible, in that sense, is some objective map that's going to guide you into meaning, purpose, acceptance by God, variety of things there. And so Peterson is much less interested in this sort of confessional exegesis, which dominates, and you'll get a certain group of people now coming from neo-Calvinists. They strongly object to Peterson's approach to the Bible. There's others that feel, because of his turn to myth, and Bishop Barron, for example, would be part of this, who's generally quite appreciative of Jordan Peterson, and rightly and legitimately so, is he would sense or feel he's picking up the scent in Peterson of a Gnostic, because Peterson turns to Carl Jung and some key psychologists who tend to see great texts of the world, whether it's Greek or Latin or Indian or Asian or biblical, as supplying myths and archetypes that go deep into the collective unconscious. And so there's a tendency to say, well, his approach to the Bible has tendencies to be Gnostic in that sense. And I think that's an inappropriate understanding and read of Jordan Peterson as well. There's far more to Peterson, even though he will explicitly mention his indebtedness to people like Carl Jung, and you might obviously someone like this with Joseph Campbell, A Hero with a Thousand Faces, and many other people like that. Might also, this whole mythic tradition goes back to Syria Eliade and his great work and on myth. Important to note here that myth is not an untruth. Myth is an eternal truth wrapped in the garments of a story. We might want to ask why the great interest, for example, in things like, say, Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and stuff. Are these historically true in that sense? Well, of course not. We don't have Uruk-hai and we don't have dwarves running all around. But what's the mythic truth? What draws people to these great stories? And so some people then compare a mythic approach to a historic approach. And if it's not historically grounded, then myth is an illusion of sorts. And that totally misunderstands how myth operates in that. And so you'll get certain people who want to see Peterson's mythic approach or psychological approach as problematic because it's not historically grounded. But we all know that many of the great works of that people are drawn to today, as I mentioned, like Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, these are not historically true in that sense. But why are people drawn to the stories? Well, it obviously speaks to them at a deep level. It calls forth parts of them, the way they look at the world. And so myth and history are not necessarily disconnected in that sense. I mean, C.S. Lewis's great statement, just as just as myth transcends history, so the incarnation transcends myth. Lewis was very, very clear that that myth and incarnation are not separate, or and to take the Jungian Gnostic approach, that if you're interested in a mythological read of something, therefore it eludes history, it eludes time, and you live in this abstract sphere that is disconnected. Well, most of Peterson's work is all about engaging people in time to face themselves, to look at their dark side, to look at their shadow sides, to look at the areas in their life where they make excuses for not facing into their shadow. And so there's nothing or unhistorical about Peterson's approach to a mythic read of the text itself. So then let's just briefly touch on elements of Peterson's approach to the Bible, and how in many ways his mythic or psychological read of the Bible is in one sense a portal into what we would call the early Christians' understanding of the mystical, or what we would call the spiritual reading of the Bible itself. And the key thing to note here is that Peterson is not going to talk, as many Christians do, about speaking authoritatively and finally about God. He's in terms of his level of humility, it's like, unlike Milton, who wants to justify the ways of God to men in Paradise Lost. The danger of that, it's very easy to slip into cheap grace, and so grace becomes sort of a snake oil or a magic bullet in which you're magically transformed. Peterson is much more concerned less about the theological and much more about the anthropological. What is our responsibility in terms of being transformed? And that doesn't mean he's contra grace, okay? Some people accuse him, again, of being Pelagian, and I think, again, this is unfair. At the heart of the Pelagian Arminian tradition is the relationship between grace and human responsibility or human will. And it's as Bunyan says, he footed it well and she answered him handsomely. In one sense, God foots it well, but we have to answer, we have to respond. And in theological terms, it's simply called synergism. Okay, the energies of grace and the energies of humanity work together in terms of deification and transformation and growing up. So to accuse him of being Gnostic via Jung, to accuse him of being, these are all ways of not dealing with the issue per se, okay? And if we can, the danger is when we attempt to interpret someone, we want to systematize them, we want to bottle them, we want to cabin, crib, and confine them. And with Peterson, it's a bit like holding water in your hands or bottling lightning. There's so much to him, and the human mind has a tendency, well, to say, I've got him figured out now, or I know where he's coming from. And so we throw terms around like Gnostic and Pelagian. In that way, the tendency is to think I understand what Jordan Peterson is up to. And he's much more elusive in terms of the area he covers than any of that. So let's get then now to briefly touch on myth. As I mentioned earlier, Messiria Eliade and many great writers of the 19th and 20th century, actually George Eliot's great work, Middlemarch, Casaubon, the mythographer, as it were, tries to bring all these great myths together in the world and look at there's a great unity amongst myths that point the way forward. And so the interest in myth has been there actually pre obviously George Eliot. But it's another way of seeing, other than, say, the rational, the cognitive, the systematizing, the creedal, the confessional, the philosophic arguments. This is a way of saying, listen, myths tell stories about ourselves that go pretty deep about self-understanding, and in that sense, they can be historical, because history is its own myth, unfolding constantly. But there's also stories that go as old as time, go as old as civilizations, and they cross civilizations. Some of those great mythic themes share an amazing amount of affinity in terms of the human condition, in terms of what it means to be human, the nature of transformation, the nature of the human pilgrimage, the human journey. And obviously the Bible is a significant text in terms of what it's trying to say about the nature of the human journey itself. And there are these constant affinities between myth and fairy tale. Most of us have grown up, certainly in the West, with a multiplicity of fairy tales, whether it's Beauty and the Beast, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Pinocchio, which most people, which I might add, Peterson comments on quite a bit in terms of its layered nature. Next to the Bible, it has been the most translated story in all of human history. So, and this is why I think one of the reasons Peterson is interested in that. Other fairy tales like Beauty and the Beast, we can go on and on with stories like these are fairy stories, but there's all sorts of affinities between fairy stories and myth. And that's why the constant interest in fairy stories, because some would argue they're just secular myths in that sense. Messiria Eliade argued the nature of myth is it gives you at heart and soul the sacred stories that speak much about the origins of what it means to be human. And then people from moving on from Eliade to Joseph Campbell and obviously Carl Jung and many others, they're trying to tap in to say there's something deep in the soul, and we're not just a matter of historic beings thrown into time with no sense of order, direction, but in fact buried deep within the whole human soul and spirit, there are these ancient stories that to the degree we listen to them, internalize them, and live from them, we are truly free. So just to think that in terms of anthropology is what's the West come to see, we're just an open-ended project with no structure, internal structure, order deep down. And when we violate that structure, we do hurt and harm to ourselves individually and to culture itself. So these great mythographers, as it were, commentators on them, unlike a certain understanding of liberalism that says the human soul is an open-ended project and we can make ourselves anything we want, myths say, no, you can't. In fact, there's an order to the human soul, and in fact, if that order is not known or violated, we become imprisoned by our own drivenness. And this is why myth is so important to understand, because this built-in structure. Now, Peterson, of course, in his many lectures then turns to the Bible as the great myth, and he hasn't got very far because he goes in depth in terms of spading the great biblical myths. But what's at the heart, for example, Genesis, obviously the first book in the Bible, Greek word kinesis, is the foundation of all myths. So the story of Adam, Eve, the serpent, Eden, east of Eden, this is a great myth about, for Peterson, it's about the unconscious and people not really being alert to what evil and goodness is, making decisions that all of a sudden they awake from the unconscious to the conscious, and then all of a sudden, and then as a result of choices, both good and evil dwells within them. And the story of Genesis is really about people becoming cognizant that they can make decisions for the good and become better people through choice. And Peterson is very strong on this one, choice. We can make decisions based from a certain mythic structure deep down, or we can make decisions, there's a deep darkness in the human psyche as well. And to the degree we heed that structure, or what Plato would say, follow the dark horse rather than the light horse, it takes us in certain directions. So we have both dwelling within us. Peterson will mention again and again, we bear the image of God. That image itself is tarnished, it's tainted. And so as a result of this, Genesis gives us a foundation myth. So if you just read it literally, was there a literal Adam and Eve, and where is Eden, and what does it mean to live? That misses the whole point. Adam and Eve are, in that sense, we are all Adam, okay? We are all part of the human condition, and we have these two elements dwelling within us, and this is the genius of the birth of all myths, the Eden myth. The choices we all make choices that take us one direction or another, and we are responsible for those. What part of us we choose to hear and heed, and there are consequences of making those choices. And so Peterson lingers at the early chapters of Genesis. Also, part of it is the nature of speech or word. Our speech or our language can bring goodness into life. That usually comes from deep recesses of the soul, because the speech reflects the soul. Or speech can be made to bring totalitarian order, or it can be used to hurt and to harm people. And so the whole element of what, when God speaks into existence, order and goodness comes into being. But the nature of speech also can be that which causes harm, can lead to breaking down of relationships. It can come out of vindictiveness, anger. And so the very nature of speech, which is at the heart of Genesis itself, we who bear the image of God, much hinges on how we speak things into being or do not speak things into being. It can lead to chaos if speech is done in such a way that harms and hurts people. Then chaos comes to dominate. If speech is used in a way that brings meaning, dialogue, interaction, then you get healthy order in that sense. So the early chapters in Genesis again go back to one of his major themes, the relationship of good order and chaos, and bad order, and then also good chaos and bad chaos. One of the myths he plays quite a bit on, which ties him into Nietzsche and in Aesop's fable, is the Cain and Abel myth. Most people read the Cain and Abel. Well, Cain killed Abel, and God was more pleased with Abel than Cain. But why did Cain kill Abel? Well, this goes back in some ways. It has a lot of similarities to an Aesop's fable and what Nietzsche draws from that fable. In the particular fable, you have the fox and you have the grapes. The fox in the autumn, it sees these luscious, nutritious grapes, and it thinks it's going to fill itself up with the nutritious as it were, the wine from the grape. But it keeps jumping up, and it can't get those particular grapes. And so what the fox decides to do, it says, well, the grapes must be rotten, they're of no use. Rather than the fox saying, well, perhaps I have to grow up, I have to learn to jump a little higher, I have to learn the skills to get the grapes. The easy way is to say, well, the grapes are rotten. This is what Nietzsche calls resentment. Often what we can't get, we can't attain, then we demean, we diminish, we say it's of no value. And in this sense, what Peterson is doing with the Cain and Abel myth, essentially, Cain admired his brother Abel. He couldn't attain what Abel was in terms of being pleased by God. So rather than himself being transformed and becoming a new person, what does he do with the person that, in fact, on one hand he admires, but he doesn't want to engage in the effort to change as a human person and become? He kills. And so often the nature of the person who's enmeshed in resentment, they want to demean, they caricature, or they kill that which they don't want to deal with, because the other who is further down the road mirrors into them what they could be if they were willing to face into those dark and difficult places and be transformed. But because they don't want to do it, then they kill. And so the myth of Cain and Abel is really a myth in many ways of the Aesop's fable of the fox and the grapes, and Nietzsche's comment on the whole theory of resentment and how it works. And we can see this played out in the culture wars all the time at present time, this theory of resentment. People who are drawn to Peterson, they don't like some of his positions. They demean him as a human being. And a lot of his work, 12 Rules for Life, is about growing up in many ways and facing those issues of ourself where we're insecure, where we don't want to face into our shadow side, don't want to do the hard internal work that sets us free as a human being. And so then what they do is they try and trash Peterson. It's a classic case of resentment. Now, whether you agree with Peterson or not is not the point. It's just how the psychological theory of resentment works in terms of it's usually it's an ad hominem in logic, in terms of we dismiss a person. We don't deal with the content. We dismiss them as a human being because of their place in society, the color of their skin, and stuff like that. But it's classic. So we're back to the Cain and Abel. So we just kill the person rather than dealing with the content of their challenge, which is offered before us. And so here you get again a mythological read. Now, was there a literal Cain and Abel? Can you find out where that's not the point of the text. That's not the point of the text itself. Now, the great myth is obviously Jacob wrestling with God through the night. Now, can we find a place, the area where Jacob wrestled with God throughout the night and his hip was thrown off? No, you can't do that. But the theme of each person wrestling with the big ideas of life and how they get transformed by that, and the implications of it, that's a mythic theme of someone having to, rather than ignoring the big metaphysical issues, the big religious issues, they grapple with them throughout the night. Now, elements, for example, of the new atheists, what are called the four horsemen of the new atheists, you get Harris and Dennett and Dawkins, and there was Hitchens. Hitchens is now dead, so there's what they call now the four riders. You bring in Hershey Ali, who's hooked very much in with Sam Harris, so they're now called the four riders of the new atheism. But again, rather than dealing with these larger metaphysical and religious themes, they just dismiss them. And so we're back to the Cain. We kill what we don't understand. And many of the new atheists, many of them just come from a very literal, simplistic read of the Bible, and they'll pick worst-case scenarios without understanding how do we mythically read these. So they're, in their own way, they're simple literalists in that sense, and they do not know how to read the multi-layered nature of the text. And so this approach, a mythical approach to the text, to take, for example, a very common book, Peterson hasn't got to it yet, say the Song of Psalms, one of the most sensual texts of the Bible. At a literal level, it can be read between a man and a woman. The mystical level, it's between the soul and God. The ecclesial level, it's between God and the church. And you can go on and on with these layered. And any text of the Bible can be read. There's six layers of reading, and some people just talk about the fourfold. In fact, there are 6 ways of reading any text. And that's where myth plays a very, very significant role. But for Peterson, underlying what he's doing is it's an anthropological mythical, and you could throw an existential. His question is really, what is the significance of the text, and particularly the many stories in the text, for our own self-understanding, our own the transformation. And so each of these sort of stories in the Hebrew canon, he also moves very nimbly into the New Testament as well, tell stories, if we have but ears to hear, about our inner selves. And so the whole theological approach, it's not that he denies that it's important, but his work is much more in the anthropological, the mythic, anthropological, existential. And once his approach is understood in coming through that portal, then he can't be blamed for being Pelagian or Jungian or not being confessionally or literal and stuff. That's not his interest. His interest is in a mythical, psychological. And once people understand what myth is, in terms of a perennial story, the perennial truth wrapped in the garments, this is his hermeneutic, this is his exegetical portal, and so he'll return again and again. He's trained as a psychologist, so he's not trained as a biblical exegete, he's trained as a psychologist, and he's applying the themes of the Bible mythically to the human journey, and he's met with many people over the years in counseling. He finds these stories quite helpful in illuminating these themes. Now, I just want to move one step forward here and look at the relationship then between a mythical approach. I might just add one more myth. Jonah. Most people grow up with the story of Jonah and the whale, and Jonah gets swallowed. God tells him to go to Assyria after a series of events swallowed by the whale. He then goes into a pout because things happen the way he didn't want them to. Now, Jonah can be read in a variety of ways. The story of Jonah, almost from an evangelistic perspective, so that's one way. The other, it's Christological, just as Jonah was 3 days and the whale was resurrected, so Jesus is 3 days and the resurrected can be read in a political sense. Jonah as sort of the Netanyahu of our time. The Assyrians were the enemy. He had to learn to love the other, just as God loved the other. So here you have a great myth of someone who sees the other as the enemy, himself as the pure one called by God, the remnant, and God calls him, in fact, he is to love the enemy, just as the Jews or the Palestinians. means today. It can be read in that way. Then there's the anthropological read of Jonah. We all run from ourselves. Okay, and we are often called to go deeper, to know ourselves in a more honest and truthful way. And often because we don't do that, we get ourselves into a very dark and painful night. We're swallowed by darkness. And it is at those places then we have to face ourselves in a more meaningful level. So there's a death, and there's multiple deaths in any meaningful journey. And then we're thrown forth. So we go into the beast of who we are, the dark side and that side, and then all of a sudden, as we are willing to be honest with ourselves, then in fact we are thrown back on the land. And we also then begin to see other people differently. So from a harsh religious perspective, where we see those who are not of us as the problem, to all of a sudden embracing those who are not of us and seeing them because we've been transformed, we have died, we have resurrected, we're a different person. So there's the anthropological read. So it's a myth in that sense. Are we going to read it at a literal level? We're going to read it at a Christological level? We're going to read it at a political level? We're going to read it at that sense, a mystical, transformative level. So again, the book of Jonah, Song of Songs, all of these sort of things. Now, there's a close connection then when we start talking about a mythical, existential, anthropological read of the texts, and then what the church fathers and mothers would call a spiritual reading of the text, because the spiritual reading of the text has a lot of affinity with the mythical reading. And so you look at how the mothers and fathers read the Old and the New Testament constantly. It was about transformation. So, for example, in Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Moses. Now, at a literal level, you can read the Jews are in Egypt, they're in slavery. God comes to Moses, they cross the Red Sea, then the desert and the Promised Land. Well, that's in one sense a Jewish nationalist myth. The other is that we are in the Egypt of our false self, and inevitably we are called out of the Egypt of slavery, which we think are free, but in fact we are in bondage to a shallow and false self, and we are called out of that, out of the land of Egypt, where it's secure, where it's predictable, but we're unfree, to the cost of freedom, and what Bonhoeffer would call costly grace in that sense versus cheap grace. And so people like Gregory of Nyssa, and there's many others, will look at the whole mythic element of the Exodus, and this is the second book, obviously, of the Hebrew canon, or the X, out of Hodos, the way. So what is the way out of our internal bondage psychologically and spiritually into the promise in which we recover our image and likeness? Well, you can see that this spiritual reading of the text, when a person goes beyond simply the literal, the moral, the typological, the anagogical, into the anthropological, mystical, has a lot of affinities with the mythical. And so when Peterson is turning to the mythical, there's an amazing portal between the mythical and the mystical. And I think if people follow where Peterson is going in terms of his deeper mythical read of the text, or the existential read, or the psychological read, because there's a close connection between the psyche and the pneuma in terms of self-understanding. And so this is where probably Peterson, more than any other person at the present time, is drawing people into a deeper read of the text, which then can open, if properly understood, to the mystical or the spiritual reading of the text itself. And with the great interest in today in the contemplative, the mystical, the spiritual theology, it's not much of a step to go from the mythical to the mystical, or to the spiritual reading of the text. And anyone who reads any of the mothers and fathers of the church, and those continued that sixfold understanding of how you read the text, will see Peterson takes them beyond the literal, the historical, without denying it. It's not a matter of one or the other of six. It's a bit like a theological clown keeping many balls in the air. And these different exegetical means, some people juxtapose in the early church Antioch and Alexandria, which is quite unfair, because Alexandria, from Origen onward, I mean, the first great Christian university was in Alexandria, and Origen set in place, drawing from a much older tradition, these layered levels of reading the text. And you look at his approach, and so it's a very easy step to move from Jordan Peterson's mythical, existential, psychological, right into Origen and Alexandria, and then you just follow that whole Alexandrian tradition up through Evagrius Ponticus, Gregory of Nyssa, any of these. You get the same thing in Western exegetes as well. So I think the key thing to note, and I'll conclude here, is that if one is going to get focused on Peterson's approach to the Bible, and obviously he could be tracked in many other ways, but if many people come from a Christian background are obviously quite interested in Peterson, is not to dismiss him as being Pelagian or because he's interested in Jung as Gnostic. He's certainly not a literalist, certainly respect for evolution and trying to understand how the Bible, and particularly its great mythic structures, reflect and actually can co-inhere with an evolutionary understanding of the Bible. So it doesn't have to be either or, theology, Bible, or science. In fact, he's very interested in synthesizing. And his particular mythical approach to the text, anyone who's followed the multiple lectures he's given in Toronto, and then his big early magnum opus on maps of meaning, and then 12 rules for life, can see how he again uses the Bible. And then if you follow Peterson further, it's a very easy pathway to take from a mythical psychological read of the text into a mystical spiritual reading of the text. It's just a few more steps down there. It'll be interesting to see where Peterson goes with that. So I'll conclude with that then. So Jordan Peterson and the Bible, trying to get a good understanding. What is myth? Myth is not separate from history. Myth just deepens our understanding of history. And anyone who can reflect even on their own journey why they enjoy fairy stories or why Lord of the Rings is popular, or Harry Potter or Star Wars, these are great myths. And how the Bible, in many ways, the great themes of the Bible can easily be seen in those great mythic works. We've all grown up on fairy stories, which are secular myths, because myths tend to have a much more deeper sacred context. And so, but there is this real close affinity again between myth and fairy tale. But it isn't too far a journey in many ways from myth, fairy tale to spiritual reading of the Bible. And if people can see, he can see where in fact the pathway Peterson is on, there can be actually some excellent work done on myth and mysticism as exegetical reads or psychological reads and spiritual reading of the text. So for those who are interested in Peterson and the Bible, be careful of not reducing him to simplistic approaches. He's extremely nimble, and at this point he's extremely open. And maybe just one point, underneath all the what he does is the notion of the eternal logos, ever living, ever breathing. So the myth points the way to the living logos, the transformative logos, and this is important. Where in fact his engagement with Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger is very important. The living logos of pre-Socratic thought. So it's not a matter of just paradigms and images and myths. It's what do they mean as people are open to the engaging living logos, or what in the creeds would be called believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life. So logos and pneuma is very important in all this. So there's this in Peterson, constant this notion that history is open. And it's open, everything hinges on human choice. And so myth and history in that sense are deeply connected. For Peterson, just as spiritual reading a text is deeply connected to history itself.